Hey guys, 7 Minutes with Sean, and Pastor Scott preached an awesome message this weekend on Ephesians 5 and the family and marriage. And we're just continuing in our series Family Strong. So, man, um, if you ever think about marriage, in the old days, they used to paint marriage as this perfect, clean, not very messy kind of thing, but we know the reality of relationships, and we're all sinful, and our marriages and our lives and our relationships with our own parents, they get messy. So Pastor Scott did a great job of kind of moving us from reality. There is a reality that our relationships are messy, because the gospel tells us this, that you're a mess, and one day you may marry a mess, and if you reproduce, you'll have a bunch of little messes running around. So that's reality. And then Jesus presents the ideal. And you can't obtain the ideal unless first you have the Holy Spirit of God working in you. The Bible, Paul even said in Ephesians that you need to be filled with the Holy Spirit. And when you're filled with the Holy Spirit, then you can move from the real that is messy to the ideal. So he did a great job of doing that. And see, in Ephesians 5, it talks about wives submitting to husbands and husbands loving their wives as Christ loved the church. And Pastor Scott actually gave a great example. A lot of times when we do marriage counseling as pastors, the husbands are really good at quoting Ephesians, I believe it's 5:21. Or actually 5:22, where they'll say, doesn't it say in the Bible that wives are supposed to submit to their husbands? And usually the husband asks that question. And here's the thing. If you're a husband, that wasn't written to you. Okay, dummy? It wasn't written to you. It was written for wives. And really our job is to point them back to say, well, that's not written to you. She needs to deal with that verse. You need to deal with the next part where it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And really, the whole thing is brought together actually by a previous verse. 5:21 says this. It says, submit to one another out of mutual submission for Christ. That concept of mutual submission is working towards each other's flourishing. The husband is working to see the spiritual flourishing, the flourishing of his wife. The wife is working to see the flourishing of her husband. And in that mutual submission, that's when all of it works. And really, ultimately, it's what Jesus did for us. See, marriage is, and the family is really gospel reenactment. I believe it's Tim Keller that I heard say that first. That the husband is giving his life for the wife, just as Christ gave his life for the church. I want you to think about what that looks like. See, it says in Philippians chapter 2, it was an old hymn that the early church sang. And it said, being the very nature God, he had all the power of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself a servant. See, he had all the power in the world, but he surrendered that power for your flourishing. And husbands, that's what being a godly husband looks like. That you surrender the power that you've been given. God has said, wives, submit to your husband. Now you surrender that power for her flourishing. And see, it says when you do that you'll be exalted. It says that when he did that, he was exalted and given a name that was above every name. And in the same way, wives, when you submit yourselves to your husband, Jesus, being in very nature God, he submitted himself. He likened himself unto a servant. So you're both serving each other for each other's flourishing. Now, the truth of the matter is that is really hard to do. But when we do it, and I know in my own marriage, in my own relationships with my kids, that's when things work at their best. It's when our relationships flourish. It's when I see my wife flourishing spiritually. My job should be to see her growing in the Lord and growing in her love of God and devotion of God. And when she does that, she grows in her servanthood of me too. And it's this amazing thing. So instead of worrying about my own needs or your needs, maybe stop and think for a moment. And Pastor Scott used the term, how could I help? What could I do to help? What could I do? And sometimes to help someone flourish spiritually, it doesn't mean that you grab them and say, you're going to learn this, or you're going to get better at this, or wives, many times we're really good at guilting our husbands, saying, you need to lead me, and you're not leading me spiritually. That's not how it works. Sometimes working towards someone's flourishing is just serving them right where they're at and loving them right where they are and praying for them and just continually putting them up to the Father, because the problem with marriage is you have two free will individuals and they're both having to submit themselves to one another. And guys, when we do that, we move from the real, the messiness of relationships to the ideal. And we're reenacting the gospel. So guys, I hope you enjoyed the message. I certainly did. I got to listen to it online. I was serving in children's ministry this weekend, which was a blast. I'll talk about it next Sunday when I'm preaching. We're going to continue to talk about families and being family strong, and I'm going to talk about the next generation. So should be good. We'll see you next week. Go be the church.